What's up, guys, and welcome back to Season 2 of Ham Reviews the LCK meta. It's finally summer, and we're finally seeing some LCK games, and that means time for some meta reports. This week's games were played on patch 11.11, and yeah, let's jump straight into it. So starting off, what I have here is a figure of the top 10 most contested picks in the LCK. You can see here the yellow is games where they were not played, either pick or ban, red is bans, and blue is picks. And right away, you can see a theme that's going to be what I think the theme for this whole season, which is flex picks. Every single one of these champions, with the exception of, an AD carry like Ezreal or perhaps Gnar, can be played in multiple roles. And we'll see across the rest of this presentation that there's a lot of emphasis on flex picks this season, especially in this first week. So let's jump straight into it. Looking at the performance versus presence graph here, we can see 4 quadrants, as per usual, between champions that are potentially viable, they're performing well, but not being played very much. We have champions here that are being played a lot, but are performing just as well. And then down here we have champions that are perhaps underperforming for their presence. And then over here we have champions that are generally not doing so well, and they aren't being picked very much. One thing to note is that this early in the season, champions like Renekton, for example, since they're banned so much and they're only played like 1 or 2 games, their low win rate can be a little bit misleading. Renekton might be very good right now, but we just don't know because he's played so little, and the couple games he does get played, there's maybe not such a good performance. On the same side, something up here with 100% win rate, maybe isn't doing so great because it's like 1 game, so the sample size is small, and as the season develops, we'll have a better idea of how the champions are doing. One thing I will point out, though, is that if you look at the top quartile of presence, you'll notice the champions are appearing multiple times. This is because these champions can be played in multiple roles, and the different breakouts here on this graph reflects that. So, for example, this is a Akali top, Akali mid. You see Karma popping up multiple times, Nocturne, Renekton, Rumble, Lee Sin. These are all champions that have the ability to be played in multiple roles, and as such, are being highly valued early in the draft phase, and just in general. I want to take a moment here to introduce you guys to a concept called t-SNE, which is, according to Wikipedia, a statistical method for visualizing high-dimensional data by giving each data point a location in a 2- or 3-dimensional map, aka a way to measure how similar objects are across multi-dimensional data. So here on the left, I have a chart that shows, typically what you would get from a post-game kind of analysis. Each row is a champion, and each champion has a variety of statistics associated with it, such as what position it was played, kill participation, KDA, kills, deaths, win rate, presence, etc. And it can be really hard to look at this data and understand the relationship between different roles, different champions, what these statistics actually mean, and draw any kind of meaningful conclusion. t-SNE is a statistical method that basically takes these highly dimensional data sets and models and clusters them in such a way that they're related by reducing the dimensionality. So for example, you take a chart like this, which is just a big table full of numbers that could mean anything, and you basically generate these kinds of outputs. A 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional graph that shows relationships between different points. So in our instance, each row is a champion, and each dot on the graph will be a champion, and their proximity is how they're related. So I was really interested in applying this method as a way to interrogate, what champions are performing similarly, but might not be, recognized as good. And we'll see a couple examples of that in the next couple slides. So jumping straight out, I just split it by role here. You can see that we have certain types of AD carries clustering together up here, other types down here, and the same with supports. We have some supports down here and some supports up here. Now, because the position on the graph does not really tell you anything except how closely they're related to each other, it takes a bit of insight and nuance to understand what's going on here. Just because these champions are down here doesn't mean that they're any worse than these champions up here. You'd have to do a deeper dive into what the data actually says. But what I will say right now is, having looked at the data, you can go look at the statistics for these champions, these AD carries right here, are performing much better than these AD carries down here. Same thing with supports. These are the supports that are being picked and played And although their performance isn't as good in terms of like win rate, etc., then these ones up here, these are the ones that are being picked. So this method basically it through a series of 5,000 iterations generates these relationships, and then it spits out what it thinks is, like the most accurate representation of the relationships between the different data points. So just from eyeballing and looking at the variables of these champions and how they're similar, you can see that these champions up here tend to have some kind of long-range poke or engage, and typically are generally good scalers. In comparison, champions down here, like these AD carries, they're fighters, they're auto attack champions. Xayah is I would say a skirmisher, for example. But if you look at their win rates from this pool to this pool, these champions are performing a lot better, which is a sign of what I think is good in the meta right now. Long range scaling AD carries with self peel. Senna, Varus, Ezreal, Kai'Sa, they all have some form of self peel. Kalista and Jinx are actually performing very well also, and you could kind of clump them together here, but I just brought them out here because these are a bit different. Jinx is like a hyper scaler, and Kalista is like a lane bully. So they're not really as related to these four over here, but they're worth calling out. Now, the reason why this is so interesting is because, for example, Yuumi, Galio, these are champions that aren't being played very much. And if you look at the games that they have been played, haven't been doing so well. But if you look at the other statistics, they seem to be similar to champions like Rel, Lulu, and Sett, who are performing very, very well. So this could just give you an idea of what might be worth looking at in scrims or practice that could be brought out on the main stage that other teams might not be aware of yet. So keep an eye out to see if we see more Lulu Yuumi or Galio the next coming weeks. I did this analysis for top jungle and mid as well, and the results are not as applicable, I guess, is the best way to put it. You see some clear clumps. For example, Aurelia and Camille are down here, Akali, Lucian, and Rumble are up here, and then we have this class of kind of skirmishy, tanky engagers with Lulu, interesting, stuck in the middle there. In jungle, we actually see a pretty clear difference. You see something like Nidalee, Olaf, and Lilia, hyper clearing, low kind of like skirmishing. They're not low skirmishing champs, but they're faster clearers. And down here in the corner, we see a lot of like heavy fight-based clearing champs. So things like Lee Sin and Xin Zhao want to skirmish early. And that's not to say Olaf and Lilia don't, but generally the clear speed is what separates these two. So this could give you an idea of like, if you're a team looking for a scaling clearing champion, you would want a champion that clusters more towards the top right here, such as Kindred or Nocturne or Viego. Whereas if you're a team fight based comp or team that's looking for fights early and often, then something like Volibear, Xin Zhao, Lee Sin would be better for your suited cases. Now, I just threw this in here because this is an example of what happens when the data is not very clusterable at all. You get something like this. As you can see, it's just kind of like a random splodge onto a grid of 15 or so champions. You could try and draw some kind of meaningful, connections between some of these champions, but it's really just like reading tea leaves at this point. And after 5,000 iterations, if the modeling says there's not really that much clustering, then I'm inclined to believe it. Champions like these are pretty easily clusterable, or it's really easy to identify the clusters, but these ones not so much. So I think it's actually kind of like a symptom of the state of mid lane where these champions they're kind of just playing whatever, whatever fits, whatever works. And that's kind of like related to the flex nature of picking flex champs and then kind of just putting them wherever goes best. Moving into looking at first pick specifically on red and blue side, we basically see this pattern where on blue side, overwhelmingly, with the very minor exception of these 280 carries, we're picking flex picks that can be played in at least or up to 3 roles. Lucian, Renekton, Rumble, Karma, Lee Sin, these are all champions that in Season 11 can go top, mid, sometimes jungle, and the value of having these early in the draft is that it gives you a lot of flexibility to move them around to better suit the matchup and your team comp, and it puts a lot of pressure on the enemy team. So these are, in Season 11, flex is king. On the flip side, on red side, we actually see a very similar thing. There's a higher diversity because, of course, there's 2 picks on red side instead of 1 pick. But for the most part, it's actually a pairing of flex pick, such as Sett, with AD carry, like Kalista or Ezreal or Senna. that tends to be the case, just generally speaking, about typical draft behavior. Early flexes, early AD carry, lockdown support, and the rest of your team in the later phases of the draft. So that's what I'll talk about next, which is moving into general drafting format in the LCK. Blue side, flex, always first pick, right? We want to get something that can go in multiple roles, have multiple potential different matchups, so you weight based on difficulty, and puts a lot of pressure on the enemy to decide where that flex is going. Red side typically counters with a flex of their own, such as Nocturne into Rumble or something, and an AD carry. And then blue side rounds out the end of their first pick phase with AD carry and another flex, whereas red side, sometimes some teams in the LCK pick 2 flexes, red 1 and red 2, in which case they pick an AD carry third. Otherwise, you just pick another flex, basically. Now, one interesting thing that's different from last summer is that last summer, teams were overwhelmingly saving their last pick for support, for counter. And at least in this first week, maybe things would shape up over the course of the summer. Things will be different. But right now, teams are higher prioritizing support and then saving their counter pick to round out the draft on red side, for example. Blue side, you're kind of stuck with having to pick 2. So it ends up just being another good blind solo laner. I mean, bonus points if you can get another flex. So that makes it just easier for you to play. Now, talking about some specific drafts that I thought were really interesting, I thought the 2 drafts from the Dem1 versus SKT series were really good, partly because they gave up Rumble on blue side both games in favor of an alternate strategy that seems to have worked pretty well because they won both games. And Rumble is a really highly contested pick at the moment. Wiley seems a very good champ. And looking at these 2 different comps, we see here that we basically have Senna, so late game insurance with large scaling, and then 4 meatballs: Sett, Diana, Jace, and Lucian. Jace is kind of interesting because he can poke as well as engage with his melee form, but for the most part, we're seeing a lot of beefy meatball champs that can go in and basically fight, which is interesting because it worked really well against Rumble. On the flip side, they played this comp in Game 3, which it looked a little bit dicey at the beginning. If anyone watched the game, you'll know that T1 was actually ahead for a large part of it, and then a crucial misplay basically gave Dem1 the game. But overall, this formula of Enchanter solo lane plus engage support, 2 skirmishers in the form of Shinzao and Akali, plus late game AD carry Kaisa, who can also self-peel, engage, and sort of poke with her W, ended up, being able to take advantage of the small mistakes that SKT made. So I actually think that this formula of 2 sup, 2 skirm, 1 AD carry is actually one of the best kind of class compositions that you can make at the moment to really be well-rounded and almost good at, pretty much everything. And then finally, I was watching the games, I saw this comp right here, just looked like really fun to play, really kind of, tough as an AD carry if you're playing into, Volibear, Akali, Nocturne, and then Ezreal can poke and he can go in with his E, So I thought this comp was a pretty easy on paper to execute comp that also was pretty fun and effective. Yeah. So I have some comments here for coaches. Flex is king in Season 11, if you didn't know that already. For the AD carries pool specifically, it looks like long scaling AD carries that have some kind of range advantage or poke or engage, or they're outperforming champions like Tristana or Xayah or the typical fighter champions. So since games are kind of going a little bit longer, you want to have that insurance to be able to perform. In terms of your general drafting strategy, you want to get your AD carry early with the ability to flex the other 2 picks, and then save your second ban phase for things like support and counter pick. In terms of supports, as is kind of like the norm with competitive playing, easy engage go button supports, that can just kind of hard engage and go in, they generally lend to easier to execute comps, which makes them look better. And then one interesting thing that I've noticed specifically from this past week is that solo lane enablers. So enchanters in the solo lane to buff junglers and the other solo lane seem to be really strong. And I think as the meta develops over the next couple of weeks, we're going to see more of this. We're going to see things like Soraka mid, Lulu mid, to enable these Shinzaos and Dianas and, Nocturnes that are basically going into fighting all the time. Because right now we are in a very skirmish-based meta, and damage is actually not, lacking for a lot of these comps. So having, an enchanter in the mid lane who can buff your teammates but also do some damage is actually really good. So I think one thing to be looking out for is this 2-2-1 composition where you have 2 skirmishers, preferably mixed damage, so they can't be easily itemized against, and then you have 2 supports. One is the Soul Lane Enchanter to help buff your jungler and your other Soul Laner, and then the other one is a Hard Engage, just to give your team a tool to be able to go into like maybe some like slippier comps or comps that are poking you from a range or trying to play the space. And then of course an AD carry that has some kind of long range ability, either whether it be through poke or longer auto attacks, and then self-peel, or some way to go in. So Kai'Sa is like, the perfect example of this. Has an ult that gives her shield, movement, and it's just the perfect form of self-peel. Anyways, so that's pretty much going to be it for this video. Thanks for watching, and if you have any comments, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or in the comments. And yeah, thanks for watching.